Many observers have found that two workable yardsticks help in discovering how near a community is to despotism: the respect scale and the power scale.
A careful observer can use a respect scale to find how many citizens get an even break. As a community moves towards despotism, respect is restricted to fewer people. A community is low on a respect scale if common courtesy is withheld from large groups of people on account of their political attitudes.
The black shirts saw themselves as the front line against the socialist threat.
You could not really be a regular member, if you were in the right age group, without being part of this militia. Now, in Italy, the black shirts were the basic core membership of the party. This was a kind of special party army or party militia.
Ovazza played his part by helping to destroy trade union offices in Turin. These fascist attacks on socialism often had the open support of the police and army, as the liberal government was seen as too weak to stand up to the communist threat.
But there was also some sympathy from the state, as fascism claimed it wanted to defend the state, bourgeois society, property, and patriotic values. All those values that socialism deplored.
The strongholds of this uncompromising fascism were in the cities of central and northern Italy.
Distruggeremo I comunisti che vogliono distruggere l'Italia!
The motto of the black shirts was "Me ne frego," I do not give a damn. They considered life cheap, just as it had been in the trenches. In Lombardy in December 1921, one of the most senior socialist leaders was kidnapped and beaten to death. Women and children were forced to watch to learn the fate of those who opposed fascism. The local fascist bosses were not concerned with parliamentary procedures. They believed socialism could only be eradicated by force. The fascists didn't defeat the socialist councils in elections. They simply stormed the town halls.
Socialists have lost control of the town hall forever.
The fascist takeovers had a dramatic impact. By the end of 1921, the party had grown from 20,000 to over 200,000 members. And it tasted electoral success too. 38 fascists, including Mussolini, were elected to parliament. Fascist support was surprisingly widespread. The socialists were beaten, the government was weak, and the army sympathetic. Mussolini realized he had an historic opportunity to strike. He decided to organize a show of strength against a liberal government in a mass march on Rome. 25,000 black shirts set off for the Italian capital, demanding power.
After World War I, Italy had a parliamentary government that seemed really incapable of solving the country's economic crises. Profits were declining, banks were failing, unemployment was rising. So to ensure profits, the big industrial giants and the big landowners would have to slash wages and raise prices. The state, in turn, would have to provide the big owners with tariff protections, along with massive subsidies and tax exemptions. To finance this, the population would have to be taxed more heavily, their wages rolled back, and social welfare expenditures drastically cut. It sounds like Reaganism? Well, it is, even more extremely so. But the government wasn't totally free to apply these harsh measures. First of all, Italian workers and peasants had their own unions, they had political organizations, they had cooperatives, they had their own publications, and through the use of demonstrations and strikes, boycotts, factory takeovers, occupying farmlands, the forcible occupation of farmlands, they often won some very real concessions in wages and work conditions, unemployment benefits, and they won the right to organize. And even in the face of this worsening economic crisis, they were able to mount a troublesome defense of their standard of living. I mean, troublesome for those who own the land, the labor, and the capital, and the money, and the banks, and the farms, and the factories. So the only solution really was to smash the worker and peasant organizations, in effect destroying all political and civil liberties, including the right to organize, agitate, and propagandize. The state would have to be more authoritarian and more firmly subservient to the interests of capital. Mussolini and his black shirts were around right after World War I, and for about 3 or 4 years, the big landowners and industrialists used their fascist goon squads, gave them money and gave them arms, and used them as kind of strike breakers, anti-labor militias.
In 1929, Mussolini and the Vatican signed the Lateran Pacts, giving the Church virtually everything it wanted, including its own sovereign state, the Vatican City.
The Lateran Pacts put an end to the church-state dispute. If you like, they reinserted Catholicism into Italian society. The Vatican had committed itself to fascism for the foreseeable future. It had no confidence in the capacity of democracy to protect Italy against communism.
The Pope proclaimed that Mussolini was sent from divine providence. With all opposition effectively silenced, and now with the blessing of the Church, Mussolini had a free hand to start transforming Italy into a great empire to rival that of ancient Rome.
That cult of masculinity, that war against modernism, that war against truth, that obsession with apocalyptic violence as a purging agent or cleansing agent, to make the world pure and usher in the utopia. And I think when you look closely at the ideology of the radical Christian right, those so-called Christians in the United States who want to create a Christian state, in generic terms, they're fascist. Certainly fascism conjures up historical images, as you saw, pictures of Mussolini or Hitler, but it is an ideological belief system. And that's certainly the argument of the book, that this has been a dangerous mutation. These are not traditional evangelicals. They're not traditional fundamentalists who have always called on followers to remove themselves from the contaminants of secular society, to shun political power. Evangelical leaders like Billy Graham always talked about not getting too close to power, and he himself was used and burned by Richard Nixon. This is a dangerous and radical mutation. It is about creating, using the iconography and language of Christianity to create an authoritarian, or I think arguably a fascist state.
This movement has tremendous reach within the Republican Party. I mean, I think we could argue it all but controls the Republican Party at this point. We see it with John McCain, who in 2000 called Falwell and Robertson agents of intolerance, and is now sort of falling all over himself to court this movement. I think it's a mistake to think that George Bush somehow embodies the movement. I think there's a great deal of frustration with Bush. Remember, on the issue of immigration, and there is a tension, uneasy alliance between these corporate interests and this radical movement. And I think, we should also say, as Robert Paxton points out in his book Anatomy of Fascism, that fascist movements, they always build alliances with conservative or industrial interests, and oftentimes these alliances are not seamless.
Nazism, which was to create the Second World War, was born out of the First. On November the 11th, 1918, to the surprise of German frontline troops, the war suddenly stopped. The myth grew among many of these surrendered German soldiers that they had been stabbed in the back, that the frontline troops and the 2 million German war dead had been betrayed by Marxists and Jews who had fomented dissent back at home. As these surviving troops returned to the newly democratic Germany, they took their bitterness with them. It would grow and flourish into Nazism in the south of Germany. in Bavaria. With the whole of Germany in turmoil in the spring of 1919, the unrest in Munich resulted in a left-wing takeover of the city, the Räterepublik. This culminated in April 1919 in the Munich Soviet Republic, an attempt to create a Soviet-style government of the city only 18 months after the victory of the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. Government troops were sent in to quash the rebellion, and there was open fighting on the streets of Munich. More than 500 people were killed. The soldiers were supported by the Freikorps, right-wing mercenaries paid for by the government. In Munich, there were cases where the Freikorps simply shot members of the Räterepublik out of hand. Other Freikorps members, like Fridolin von Spaun, heartily approved of the brutal measures which were being used to suppress the communist revolutionaries throughout Germany. Eugene Levinet's father was the communist leader of the Räterepublik. He was executed in June 1919.
I understand from my mother that he had been very brave the way he met his death. And in fact, he called out, "Long live the world revolution." And I realized that an honorable person would die sooner or later, either on the barricades or put up against a wall and shot.
Eugene Levinet's father was Jewish, and the anti-Semitic prejudice of those on the right was further fueled by the fact that of the leadership of the Räterepublik, most were Jewish.
Sodass natürlich in Deutschland allmählich der Eindruck entstand, ja, Bolschewismus und Judentum ist dasselbe, so ungefähr. Dass sich allgemein eine anti-jüdische Stimmung verbreitet hat, das finde ich sehr nett.
The Freikorps had the support of right-wing officers in the regular army, like Captain Ernst Röhm, a man with a simple philosophy.
Since I am an immature and wicked man, war and unrest appeal to me more than good bourgeois order. Brutality is respected. The people need wholesome fear. They want to fear something. They want someone to frighten them and make them shudderingly submissive.
In Munich, Röhm was heavily involved in the violent politics of the extreme right, and in 1919 he joined the small German Workers' Party. Here he met a 30-year-old veteran of World War I, Corporal Adolf Hitler, a man who shared with Röhm a deep hatred of communists and Jews.
The reactionary class politics are the part of fascism that our establishment historians almost never talk about. Hitler's party, for instance, was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazis. It's a very left-sounding name, National Socialist German Workers, and it was designed to win broad support among working people, even while the Nazis were destroying working-class organizations. In other words, fascism, the original Italian and German variations of fascism, was a political phenomenon that made a revolutionary appeal without making a revolution. It promised to solve the ills of the many while in fact protecting the special interests of the few with violence and terror.
Here, the term libertarian means the opposite of what it always meant in history. Libertarian, throughout modern European history, meant socialist and anarchist. It meant the socialist movement, the workers' movement and the socialist movement, it sort of broke into two branches, roughly. One statist, one anti-statist. The statist branch led to Bolshevism and Lenin and Trotsky and so on. The anti-statist branch, which included Marxists, left Marxists, Pannekoek, Rosa Luxemburg, others, kind of merged more or less into an amalgam with a big strain of anarchism into what was called libertarian socialism. So libertarian in Europe always meant socialist.
The Nazi vote had dropped to 33% in the November 1932 election. It looked like their support had peaked. But powerful figures on the traditional right still felt they had to negotiate with Hitler. They too wanted to eliminate democracy and destroy the communists. And without Hitler and the Nazis, they had no access to mass support. A former chancellor, the aristocratic von Papen, came up with a deal. Hitler could be chancellor if he, von Papen, was vice-chancellor, and there were only 2 other Nazis in the cabinet, surrounded by more traditional conservatives. The theory was, Hitler would be tamed. As a result, Hindenburg offered Adolf Hitler the chancellorship on January the 30th, 1933. Von Papen crowed, "We've hired him," and the new cabinet posed for the cameras. The Nazis would later try and rewrite history to say that Hitler became chancellor simply because it was his destiny. But in reality, Hitler had been helped into power by economic circumstance and the support and miscalculation of others.
By 1930, most of the influential landowners and big industrialists and bankers, especially the industrialists in steel, coal, and mining, had concluded that the Weimar Republic no longer served their interests, and no longer could protect their class, and that it was too accommodating to the working class and to certain sectors of light industry. So they greatly increased their subsidies to Hitler, and they propelled the Nazi Party onto the national stage.
Hitler was obsessed with the idea of the survival of the fittest, and Goebbels' propaganda films reflected this obsession. Hitler believed human beings were simply animals, and that the strongest animal would always win. If his subordinates were strong enough, then they would succeed without his help.
Man diese schönen, starken Tiere zum Kampf auf Leben und Tod. Und in ihrem Walde hätten beide so ruhig weiterleben können.
Aber liebes Fräulein Volkmann, ein ruhiges Leben ist doch nirgends in der Natur zu finden.
Aber Herr Professor, es fressen sich doch nicht alle gegenseitig auf.
Wenn auch das nicht gerade. Aber sie leben alle in einem ständigen Kampf. Dabei wird das Schwache vernichtet.
Let me ask you this hypothetical question. A healthy 30-year-old young man has a good job, makes a good living, but decides, you know what, I'm not going to spend $200 or $300 a month for health insurance because I'm healthy, I don't need it. But, you know, something terrible happens, all of a sudden he needs it. Who's going to pay for if he goes into a coma, for example? Who pays for that?
In a society that you accept welfareism and socialism, he expects the government to take care of him.
What do you want?
But what he should do is whatever he wants to do and assume responsibility for himself. My advice to him would have a major medical policy, but not before.
But he doesn't have that. He doesn't have it, and he needs intensive care for 6 months. Who pays?
That's what freedom is all about, taking your own risks. This whole idea that you have to prepare and take care of everybody.
But Congressman, are you saying the society should just let him die?
No.
Well, his first answer was something like, it's a tribute to our liberty. Okay, so if he dies, that's a tribute to how free we are. Right. He kind of backed off from that. Actually, it was a huge applause when he said that. But after later reactions from elsewhere, he backed off and said, well, the church will take care of him, or charities will take care of him, or something or other, so it's not a problem.
Right.
I mean, this is just savagery, and it goes across the board. In fact, this holds for the whole so-called libertarian ideology. I mean, you know, it may sound nice on the surface, but if you think it through, it's just a call for corporate tyranny. It takes away any barrier to corporate tyranny. It's a step towards the worst. But it's all academic, because the business world would never permit it to happen, since it would destroy the economy. I mean, they can't live without a powerful nanny state. They know it.
The historians and the political scientists and the journalists who treat the subject of fascism usually write from a centrist ideological perspective, from the political center of the spectrum, which means they usually ignore the link between fascism and capitalism, just as they tend to ignore the entire subject of capitalism itself when there's something unfavorable to say about it. Instead, they dwell on the more phantasmic components of fascist ideology, the nihilistic revolt against Western rationalism and individuality, the irrational appeals to mass submission to a leader and all that. And fascism was those things, but along with its irrational appeals, it had rational functions. It was a rational instrument for class domination and for the preservation of the existing capitalist system. One thing these historians and political scientists never talk about is who did fascism support when fascism came into power? Who did the fascists support? Well, in Italy and Germany, when they came into power, they began implementing the stern measures that were needed to rescue the capitalist economy. Labor unions were dissolved. Strikes were outlawed. Union contracts were nullified. Prominent union leaders and other labor activists were imprisoned or murdered. Union property was confiscated. Worker publications were banned. Opposition political parties were outlawed. Their leaders jailed. Civil liberties were suspended. Fascist-sponsored unions, quote, unions, were set up, and their function was to speed up production, prevent wildcat strikes, and apply punitive regulations, including fines, dismissals, and imprisonments against workers who agitated or complained of shop conditions.
A power scale is another important yardstick of despotism. It gauges the citizens' share in making the community's decisions. Communities which concentrate decision-making in a few hands rate low on a power scale and are moving towards despotism. Today, democracy can ebb away in communities whose citizens allow power to become concentrated in the hands of bosses.
What I say goes, see? I'm the law around here.
The test of despotic power is that it can disregard the will of the people. It rules without the consent of the governed. If a community's economic distribution becomes slanted, its middle-income groups grow smaller, and despotism stands a better chance to gain a foothold. Where land is privately owned, one sign of a poorly balanced economy is the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a very small number of people. In communities which depend almost entirely on a single industry, such as a factory or mine, maintaining economic balance is a challenging problem. If this condition exists over the nation as a whole, so that the control of jobs and business opportunities is in a few hands, despotism stands a good chance.
The
whole of the wood industry, for instance the factories, all the forests, were taken over by the Union. Those bosses who hadn't fled to France stayed in their homes because there'd been 17 or 18 murders among the bosses. The Union said, let's collectivize it all. And then there was a kind of takeover, and they created what was called socialized wood industry. The first thing that was done was something rather strange, but it was something the workers had never managed to get, and that was healthy working conditions in the workshops. 80 or 90 small workshops were closed because they didn't have enough lighting or ventilation, or the machinery was unsafe. Big production units were created instead.
Industry was collectivized. Women were liberated. Abortion was legalized. Barcelona celebrated its freedom. This was a revolution. The convictions of Europe's left were matched by their enemies on the right. Renzo Lodoli was an Italian fascist.
Mi sembrava che in Spagna fosse necessario difendere il cristianesimo, che era insidiato.
I thought that in Spain it was necessary to defend Christianity. It was under siege. We thought that fascism was valid as a social and political doctrine. So it was our duty to go and help those who wanted more or less the same thing as we did.
Fascism, the original 20th century totalitarian movement, is really, historically, another name for the political activity of the Catholic right-wing. There is no other name for it. Francoism, Salazarism, what happened in Croatia, in Austria, in Bavaria, and so on. The Church keeps on trying to apologize for it, can't apologize for it enough. It's the Catholic right, Mussolini. You can't quite say that about Hitler, National Socialism, because that's also based on Nordic and pagan blood myths, leader worship and so on, though Hitler never repudiated his membership of the Church. And prayers were said for him on his birthday every year till the very end, on the orders of the Vatican. And all of these facts are well known, and the Church still hasn't found a way to apologize for that enough. And whatever it is you can call that, you can't call it secular.
For many, the Republic seemed already the revolution. But the Republic's leaders knew that under the new political surface, the pillars of the old society remained untouched. A powerful and deeply conservative church hostile to change. An army accustomed to having the last word in politics. A possessing class determined to defend its privileges. Southern Spain, above all, was an area of big estates, rich landowners. Many were hated by the landless farm laborers, nearly 750,000 of them for whom daily survival was a struggle. Destruction of traditional values, communist revolution. These were the catchwords with which the insurgent generals rallied most of Spain's middle class against the Republic. Petra Roman de Bondia was a young girl from a conservative family in Salamanca.
I thought that the military uprising would bring an improvement in every sense. Our ideals and what we thought Franco and his army were going to defend were God, the homeland, the family, and order. We thought that the rising would change everything. We never imagined that it would be such a long war.
Before the war, in the 5 years of democracy between 1931 and 36, the Spanish Republic had not just been a new order. It had questioned all the assumptions of accepted society, and now some people wanted to put the clock back. Franco had begun with curious discretion. He had joined the army coup in Morocco with expressly limited aims of restoring order and crushing the revolution. But his proclamation did not invoke the church or any crusade. He did, to be sure, hint darkly about foreign influences assailing traditional values. What was surprising to some was that his proclamation concluded with the unexpectedly democratic slogans fraternity, liberty, equality. But that, he said, was the absolute order of their priority. The first army decrees gave instant comfort to its middle-class supporters. That was fairly easy. All the land the Republican reforms had shared out was to go back to the owners. Trade unions were banned. So were all political parties of the Popular Front. The nationalist original plan had been to install General Sanjurjo as commander-in-chief, but he died in a plane crash as he left Portugal to take command in Spain. It left a difficult gap. Two months later, the rebel generals gathered for a meeting in Salamanca. A strong lobby for Franco was gaining ground. All but one voted in favor of a single commander-in-chief. The sole objection was from Miguel Cabanillas, who had been temporarily appointed leader of the military junta. Next, Franco was proposed. Again, all but Cabaneas agreed. Alone among the rivals, Franco seemed to satisfy the factions. He was the man in the middle. His reputation too as a soldier ensured him popular support, and this was immediately reinforced by events.
Driving on to the relief of Toledo, the advance of General Franco's columns from the west is pushed on remorselessly. White troops and Moors, well armed and trained in modern methods of warfare, supported by powerful artillery, overcome the resistance of government militia, whose retreat is on Madrid rather than Toledo. General Franco arrives to embrace and honor Colonel Moscado, the brave and bearded commander.
The victory at Toledo inflated Franco's prestige. Even before his appointment as commander-in-chief was announced, his supporters were planning higher office for him. They proposed he should be not only supreme military commander, but head of the government. Some of his colleagues were doubtful. Nevertheless, Francisco Franco emerged as the undisputed leader and called himself head of state. On October 1st, 1936, Franco was granted all powers of the new state of Spain, at least for the duration of the war. The army generals who appointed Franco as head of government, as a military necessity, may not have realized that they were establishing a personal dictatorship. Many different groups had supported their rising. First, the conservatives, who had supported the right-wing parliamentary coalition Theda before the war. Second, the monarchists, who sought the restoration of King Alfonso. Third, the Carlists, mainly from Navarre. They were also called traditionalists. They were religious, supported a king too, albeit a different claimant, and fought for their regional rights. Fourth, the Falange, the fascist party, outlawed by the Republic. They claimed to transcend the right and left of politics, but called for a radical social revolution. General Moller, for one, was fully aware of the wild complexity of the various factions. He had successfully negotiated the support of both the Carlists and the Falange for the plot. Soon after Franco's appointment, Moller spoke to Pedro Sáenz Rodríguez, the right-wing monarchist intellectual who had joined the uprising and later joined Franco's government. Franco had never claimed to be a politician, but he was of the intuitive right, an instinctive defender of capitalism. With his brother Nicholas as secretary, he prepared his program. No working-class trade unions, help for peasants, but land for landowners, concord with the church. Above all, no democracy. That way, perhaps, the working-class opposition could be wiped out forever.
Un Estado totalitario armonizará en España el funcionamiento de todas las capacidades y energías del país, en el que dentro de la unidad nacional el trabajo, estimado como el más ineludible de los deberes, será el único exponente de la voluntad popular. Y merced a él podrá manifestarse el auténtico sentir del pueblo español a través de aquellos órganos naturales que, como la familia, el municipio, la asociación y la corporación, harán cristalizar en realidades nuestro ideal supremo.
These aims of the Spanish right could only be secured by repression. Even before Franco took command, working-class resistance was physically extinguished by advancing nationalist columns. Franco himself continued the purge.
Franco estaba un día que fui yo a hablar con él, que me llamó para una interview que le habían hecho.
One day when I went to see Franco, he called me for an interview before I was a minister. He was sitting at a table drinking chocolate, dunking bits of bread and biscuits into it, and he had a heap of files on the left and was classifying them. Some he put on the table, others on a chair. Afterwards, on leaving, I asked an adjutant what were those files which General Franco had. They were the death sentences. Those which he placed on the chair were for signing and the others for revision. It was something done quite calmly. For him it was simply a military matter.
There were few critics of these methods in the nationalist zone. Franco's supporters were united in the common cause of defeating the Republic. But as to what to replace it with, there was much dispute. First, there were the fascists, the Falange. Before the war and his imprisonment, their leader, José Antonio, had tried to present a doctrine of seductive simplicity.
Tenemos una fe resuelta, es que están vivas todas las fuentes genuinas de España. España ha venido a menos por una triple división. Por la división engendrada por los separatismos locales, por la división engendrada entre los partidos y por la división engendrada por la lucha de clases. Cuando España encuentre una empresa colectiva que supere todas esas diferencias, España volverá a ser grande como en sus mejores tiempos.
The Falange's leadership was predominantly middle class or aristocratic young men, but the movement was designed to appeal to working class sentiments, albeit staunchly anti-Marxist. Raimundo Fernández Cuesta later became Secretary General of the Falange.
We discussed whether we should wear any distinctive clothing. José Antonio said we should wear a blue shirt. It's the same color as the proletariat's overalls. And it was the same for the flag. It was black and red because that was the flag of the anarchist trade unions. We wanted ours to be similar. The same with the word comrade, traditionally used by the communists. José Antonio said, I don't see why we shouldn't claim it ourselves. Give the word comrade a different meaning.
In spite of its pretensions, the Falange never became a mass fascist party with large working-class membership. Unlike what had happened in Germany and Italy, fascism had not taken root in Spain before the war. For one thing, the economic conditions were very different. Spain was still economically in the 19th century. The groups that might have been attracted by fascism were either satisfied by conventional politics or just non-existent. There was no large petty bourgeoisie scarred by recession or defeat in a world war. The middle class was reassured that the dominant presence of the army would protect them from revolution, and the working class had suffered no disappointment that might provoke them to find an alternative to Marxist, socialist, or anarchist ideals. In 1936, however, after the February elections when democracy disintegrated into political violence, conservative youth had begun to defect to the radical alternative, and once the war began, people flocked to the Falange. It was a demonstration of allegiance to the nationalist cause, and moreover, with a purge of working-class organizations, it became a safe haven for anybody whose background was suspiciously leftist. Franco was no fool. He recognized the potential danger of disunity in the nationalist camp. To his brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Sr., he gave the job of devising a formula for uniting the factions.
Los objetivos eran evitar las discordias y las...
The objectives were to avoid internal conflicts and rivalry, which were bound to debilitate the nascent state. This was Franco's view, and as commander-in-chief and leader in the war, I think he was right. He sought to establish and maintain a certain order and discipline in the rear guard. If the rear guard was left to the whims of the different groups, things could get out of hand and could affect the situation in the fighting fronts, as happened in the Republican zone.
The Falange was in trouble. José Antonio had been killed in a Republican jail. All other potential candidates were in prison or dead, and the organization was riven with ideological and personal schism. On April 17, 1937, a former mechanic, Manuel Edia, was confirmed as leader. He had no formal education, was unimaginative, and ineffective. he was easy meat for Franco. 2 days after his election, Franco, as head of state, declared the Falange and the Carlists would be unified in one national movement under his own direction. When Adia challenged Franco's authority, he was sentenced to death, although this sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. By bringing the red-berried Carlist and the blue-shirty Falange movement under his direct leadership, Franco assured the triumph of his personal brand of authoritarian conservatism and the unity of his supporters.
For big business, despotism was often a useful tool for securing foreign markets and pursuing profits. One of the U.S. Marine Corps' most highly decorated generals, Smedley Darlington Butler, by his own account, helped pacify Mexico for American oil companies, Haiti and Cuba for National City Bank, Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers Brokerage, the Dominican Republic for sugar interests, Honduras for U.S. fruit companies, and China for Standard Oil. General Butler's services were also in demand in the United States itself in the 1930s, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought to relieve the misery of the Depression through public enterprise and tougher regulations on corporate exploitation and misdeeds.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But the country was not entirely behind the populist president. Large parts of the corporate elite despised what Roosevelt's New Deal stood for. And so, in 1934, a group of conspirators sought to involve General Butler in a treasonous plan.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government.
But the corporate cabal had picked the wrong man. Butler was fed up with being what he called a gangster for capitalism.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
In the McCormick-Dickstein Report of 1935, Congress found that plans for a military coup involving a private army headed by General Butler did exist. The Congress found that certain individuals had planned for this coup, but did not specify when the plan had been conceived, nor when or if it would seriously be implemented. So who were the alleged ringleaders of this plot? Although the congressional investigation focuses on only 2 men, Mr. McGuire and Mr. Clark, dozens of other individuals have been named as contributors to the business plot with varying degrees of proof. The names of the conspirators included some of the United States' most wealthy families in banking, media, and industry, including the DuPonts, the Remingtons, and Prescott Bush, father of George H. Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush.
It's an exact factual line in terms of the Bush family's support of fascistic philosophy or government, going back at least to George W. Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, who was one of the main financiers of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party through the Union Banking Corporation. He was a Republican, his partner a Democrat, W. Abel Harriman, and he both funded and employed slave labor at Auschwitz even after the United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor. They didn't decease from that, Prescott Bush and Abel Harriman, until they were forced to by the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1942.
It was apparent that the people in charge of planning this failed coup had made a mistake contacting Butler. The general's only aim was to protect American democracy, and he repeatedly stated that he could not understand the contradictory aims of the business plot conspirators. They said they wanted to change America for the common man, but seemed more motivated to revoke New Deal laws on businesses and put the US back on the gold standard. So this conspiracy was investigated and, to a degree, it was proven true. The people named as conspirators were not punished. Many weren't even asked to testify or meet with Congress. Many of the newspapers which had originally run a smear campaign against Butler never retracted their slanderous and misleading stories.
As today's chairman of Goodyear Tire knows, for corporations to dominate government, a coup is no longer necessary.
Corporations have gone global. And by going global, the governments have lost some control over corporations. Regardless of whether the corporation can be trusted or cannot be trusted, governments today do not have over the corporations the power that they had and the leverage that they had 50 or 60 years ago. And that's a major change. So governments have become powerless compared to where they were before.
I think it's a serious threat to our democracy, and I think people are mostly unaware of it, if not completely unaware of the threat. They're very much unaware of the front groups, unaware of how their thoughts are being manipulated and how their actions are actually being manipulated in many cases. I think they're unaware that we, to a large extent, have a plutocracy in this country, or at least an emerging one, rather than democracy. And I think that's because of the rise of power and influence of corporations and the way that they've been able to use PR and PR tactics and propaganda to get what they want.
We are drowning in propaganda, drowning in it. And I'm not speaking figuratively. I think it's threatening our lives. It's cutting off our air. It's making real democracy all but impossible. It has brought the planet to the point of ecological destruction. It's had no positive consequences whatsoever because it doesn't serve the people. It serves other interests.
I've come to believe more and more as I've been studying this problem that the real currency in democracy is honest information. That if you are on a mass scale able to pump out false information, then the whole democratic system kind of breaks up.